19 sacks, league leader, more tackles, more takeaways, and yet Myles Garrett walked away with the 2023 Defensive Player of the Year over TJ Watt. Back in 2023 when this happened, as you saw, almost every large sports media figure really disagreed with this decision. So then why did it happen? Well, I took a deep dive into the actual stats behind every single pass rusher in the last 8 years, and it turns out there might be a little bit more to this story than what Stephen A. Smith was talking about way back in 2023. Because sure, if you looked at just the raw box score, TJ Watt definitely had the edge in 2023 over Myles Garrett. He had 19 sacks, the most in the league. He also had 68 tackles, 3 forced fumbles, 4 fumble recoveries, an interception, over 35 QB hits, and 19 tackles for loss. Now compare that to Myles Garrett. He only had 14 sacks, and every other major normal box score stat, Myles Garrett was beat by TJ Watt. So if Watt outperformed Myles Garrett on all the things we would see on a box score, why did Myles Garrett win the Defensive Player of the Year? Well, there's 2 key stats and 1 follow-up experiment that I did that I think will reveal the answer. First is a stat that you will not see on a normal box score, and that is pressures. Now, these are Pro Football Focus pressures, and they define it as any play where a pass rusher successfully beats his blocker and impacts the play. So that's causing the quarterback to hurry, move up off his spot, throw the ball away, or even get sacked. Now what's crazy is even though TJ Watt had more snaps and played an extra game, Myles Garrett actually had more pressures per Pro Football Focus. It was close, 89 to 86, but that is an advantage for Garrett. But what if I told you there was an even fancier stat? I offer you pass rush win rate. Now, pass rush win rate is ESPN's proprietary metric, and it's designed to calculate how often a defender beats the individual or individuals that are blocking him. And this has to happen within 2.5 seconds of the snap to help account for things like playing against quarterbacks that hold onto the ball forever or, blitzing a ton. In other words, it's just the percentage of plays that the edge rusher wins their matchup. And from one of my favorite people to follow, Seth Waller, you can see this chart, which shows the ESPN pass rush win rate and the percent of time that that pass rusher was double teamed on this beautiful scatter plot. Now, Myles Garrett and TJ Watt are both elite at beating the offensive linemen matched up against them, but Myles Garrett was winning those matchups more frequently than TJ Watt. In fact, he had the second best pass rush win rate in the entire league. And Myles Garrett was winning more often despite being double teamed almost 3 times as frequently as TJ Watt. Now, as a Cowboys fan, I can't help but point out a potential third candidate that just breaks this chart, but that's a different video for a different day. Now, when it comes to fandoms though, I will say if you are this deep into this video and you are a Steelers fan, you're probably thinking, why is Max bothering with all of these fancy stats that loosely relate to sacks when we could just count the number of sacks themselves? Like, that seems to be the main argument for TJ Watt, was he was making these game-changing plays in 2023. He had more sacks, more forced fumbles, and that's what matters at the end of the day. That's what turns the ball over. That's what allows your offense to score points. That's what wins games. And I've always wondered that too. Like, should we care about the result stats like sacks, or should we care about the process stats like pressures? And there are some really cool articles about it, but it wouldn't be a YouTube video if we didn't try and test this ourselves. So I looked into every single snap from every single defensive lineman from 2018 to today. Now, we are only going to look at regular season stats, and I'm only including in my sample defensive linemen that had at least 5 pressures on the year. That gave us 1,957 player seasons to work with. So like Myles Garrett is going to show up as multiple rows in here, right? Because he had multiple seasons for that one player. Now for each of these, we looked into total sacks, total snaps, and total pressures. Now, one small caveat, Pro Football Focus is proprietary and paywalled, so we can't actually see their game by game and player by player data. So we have to use Pro Football Reference pressures, which actually does come from a box score. Now, PFF and PFR, both looking at pressures, I get how it can be confusing, but in short, Pro Football Focus is probably the better metric to use, but we don't have access to it, so we're going to use PFR pressures. So yes, we're using PFR pressures, not PFF pressures, just because of the paywall, but for the sake of this experiment, that's fine. Now, for starters, it is important to point out how closely related pressures and sacks are. If you were to plot a player's sacks on the year and pressures on the year, and then do that for all 1,957 points in our sample, you get what looks like a beautiful relationship. And that makes sense, right? Like, these two things are very related, and knowing one of them gets you about 90% of the way towards knowing the other one. But the strength of this relationship is not a perfect 100%. So is that small difference large enough to mean anything? Well, let's try to answer two key questions. First, which stat, sacks or pressures, does a better job at remaining reliable with itself over time? Because sure, players get better and players get worse, but if we're going to be evaluating players on a single stat, we would hope that that stat is stable enough year over year so that good players are consistently good. And for that, both pressures and the rate of pressures, so pressures divided by total snaps, both of those are more stable than sacks and sack rate. In other words, if you knew that somebody had a ton of pressures and a ton of sacks this year, and you want to guess which one's more likely to be awesome again next year, the much smarter bet is to expect them to produce a ton of pressures next year. It's not necessarily as reliable to expect them to have a ton of sacks next year. And that makes sense, right? Like, sacks are somewhat related to luck because either the quarterback holds it for too long, or maybe your other pass rushing teammates don't get there quick enough on sometimes, and maybe you do get there. Like, I'm not saying that sacks are luck based, but it seems like there's very little relationship as far as who's converting pressures into sacks. Like, one year you're converting half your pressures into sacks, and the next year you're converting 10% of your pressures into sacks. So we can see that pressures and pressure rate are both very reliable year over year. But what about just predicting how many sacks somebody's going to get, right? Like, if we want to know how good somebody is at producing, at getting sacks, and all we know is how many pressures or how many sacks they got last year, which one of those two numbers is going to predict this year's sacks better? Well, again, even though sacks this year to predict sacks next year sounds like it makes so much more sense, it's actually not a better predictor. If you and I had to predict how many sacks TJ Watt is going to have in this upcoming season, we should rely more on his pressures from the past year, not on his number of sacks, even though it's the same stat, just a later year. So when you combine those two key metrics that I talked about first, and then our experiment later, I actually think I'm starting to understand the argument for Myles Garrett. According to ESPN, he was winning his matchups against the people that were responsible for blocking him more frequently than TJ Watt, and he was doing that while being double teamed at a much higher rate. So he was doing his job more frequently against tougher competition. And no, we're not going to analyze individual schedules or whatever. Like, tougher competition in this case means that you're literally getting double teamed 3 times as often. And according to Pro Football Reference, all of those wins turned into him getting more pressures on the quarterback than TJ Watt, even though he did it on less total snaps. The only thing that didn't convert for Myles Garrett was all of those pressures into sacks, the same way that they did for TJ Watt. However, from our own research, we were able to see that sacks are not nearly as reliable year over year, and that the best predictor of next year's sacks isn't this year's sacks, but this year's pressures. In other words, I don't want to say the L word, but it does seem like luck plays a big role in whether your 50 pressures turn into 18 sacks or 8 sacks. But I'm not going to end this video by just saying TJ Watt got lucky and people voted for Myles Garrett because they didn't want to reward luck. But the truth is, converting pressures into sacks, and some of those sacks into splash plays like forced fumbles and recovered fumbles, always are going to involve some element of timing, opportunity, and yes, I think luck. And while Watt may have had more of some of those big time plays in 2023, like the sacks and like the forced fumbles, Myles Garrett and TJ Watt play a position where you have to beat offensive linemen in the pass rush and disrupt the play, and Myles Garrett was doing that more frequently against more double teams on less snaps. Now, how much does luck really factor in all of this? I have no idea, but I do feel like it plays a bigger role than most typical fans want to admit. But that's a whole different discussion for a whole different video. Until then, thanks for watching. Would love to hear your thoughts on this. Even if you think I'm dumb and that TJ Watt got robbed, that's fine. I'm still going to say that Micah Parsons should have won. That's okay. Either way, I appreciate you watching. See you next time. Peace out.